you everyone for joining today in this morning's webinar, where we will be exploring Purpose Bureau's and Monash Business School's first research release from a climate risk series. I will do some more formal intros in a moment, but I just acknowledge we've got Terence Jeyaretnam also appearing today as a co-host of today's session, and we've got Jack Bisset and Melissa Clarkson, who will also be providing some specialist input as part of a panel discussion a bit later on. For those that don't know, my name is Nick Kamper and I'm the CEO of Purpose Bureau, Asia Pacific's largest ESG bureau. Purpose Bureau maintains a central business register of all businesses in all global economies and organizes thousands of data assets to be able to compile an informed view on every business in an economy, whether it's a bank to a retailer all the way down to the smallest cafe on your street. It uses those insights to determine a carbon profile, a decarbonisation pathway, and a climate risk view of those businesses. And the way Purpose Bureau is typically used is as currently the most widely used application for audited Scope 3 emissions and climate risk across the value chain. That's just a bit of context as it sets up for a little bit of how this research has come together a bit later on. As I mentioned today, we're co-hosting today's session with me is Terence Jeyaretnam. Terence has a CV in sustainability that goes back to when dinosaurs roamed the continent and we had a previous climate disaster. Terence built what was at the time Australia's largest sustainability consultancy, Net Balance, which was acquired by Ernst & Young. Alongside leading a senior portfolio of ASX 50 audit clients over the last decade and much more. Terence is also on the board of the Auditing and Assurance Standards Board. He's chairman of Amnesty International and is also on the board of the Australian Conservation Foundation. Terence, in his spare time, when he's not doing karate classes, is also an associate professor of Monash Business School, which facilitates an excellent climate risk course for professionals in Australia. If you haven't participated in any of their courses, I can vouch for the curriculum and the courses that Terence pulls together. He often gets a lot of really great industry participants along, which of course today is a good reflection of as well in Melissa and Jack. I'll run through the format of today in just a moment, but I'd like to thank and introduce two expert panelists who've joined today to provide some insights on their vantage point when it comes to some of the subject matter and the topic of the report we'll discuss. Melissa Clarkson's the General Manager of Sustainability and ESG at Vicinity Centres, an ASX 50 company. She leads a really comprehensive program across not just mandatory reporting, but also in business, in a business where transition risk is a core function of the economics of how the business runs, both because of its property or its physical assets that it owns, but also a lot of the energy consumption in its value chain emissions as well. Melissa has a lot of experience across a lot of businesses, and not just purely in sustainability, but also broadly speaking in economics and public policy. And I personally think she's one of the sharpest minds in sustainability practice in Australia. So thanks, Melissa. Jack Bisset leads the climate implementation at the AASB, the Australian Accounting Standards Board. So everything that's coming out right now, all of the standards that we're using to guide our ASRS reporting across corporates in Australia, Jack has a heavy hand in them, how they're translated and communicated to the broader industry and community, as well as updating guidance and channeling input from corporates across Australia. We'll touch base a little bit after about how to get in touch with Jack and AASB should you be looking for more guidance. I'm not sure where we're at, but we're trying to convince him to give his personal phone number. But I think we're at the very least, we've got an email from AASB we'll be able to distribute. Oh, Um, we've Jack. So the last thing I was going to, sorry, I just lost my camera just there in a moment. The last thing I wanted to say was in terms of Jack's background. Jack's got a really great background in being quite intimately involved in New Zealand's climate standards over the last couple of years and the implementation of them as well. So we're very fortunate to have him. Well, both AASB is fortunate to have him as well as us fortunate to have him here today to be able to put some context behind some of the road bumps and the preparedness journey of corporates as they look to adapt to the reporting requirements. That's the intros. Today's format will be we'll begin with 10 minutes of myself providing an overview of the key findings of the report we released in the last fortnight, which has gotten quite a wide consumption and feedback across market, which we're super pleased with. We've got about 25 minutes there from where Terence Jeyaretnam from Monash will facilitate some Q&A with our expert panelists, Melissa and Jack, getting some of their take and vantage points of what the report is showing, their interpretation of those insights, the context, and some of the industry applications of those insights as well. Then after that, we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A from the audience. So here's my housekeeping gateway into saying that there is a Q&A feature on the webinar screen down on the bottom in the middle. What you can do and you're invited to do is submit a question at any time during this session. It will go into a canister that Terence can access later on once the Q&A starts. And if you want to direct those questions to anyone specifically, feel free to. If you want to make them a generic or a general question, also you're encouraged to as well. Last piece of housekeeping is that we are recording and we will be publishing this session on our YouTube channel. And we will also be sending a direct link to the report and the recording after this as well. Terence, I believe, may be putting this on his TikTok channel, which he's desperately trying to get a big audience on. So we'll distribute that there as well. That's the end of housekeeping and format. I just wanted to spend, as I mentioned, the first 10 minutes just talking through the report we released, what it tried to achieve, and what kind of insights have come out of that report since the release. So the climate risk, and I will pull something up so that you're not staring at my face talking numbers for the whole time, but the context by which this report or the research was approached is quite critical to, in my view, why it's quite transformative and what it shines a spotlight on. What we're trying to achieve, or what Monash University and Purpose Bureau are trying to achieve with the Climate Risk Series, is to not just generate data and statistics on companies that are reporting, although that's a really good and useful starting point, but rather work towards being able to use these insights so that corporates can better report themselves. So can we use our understanding of who has to report to better understand climate risk within a corporate by looking at who it trades with, for instance, from a counterparty standpoint? Can we use a really good understanding of who has to report to better understand what kinds of industries are best or not best served by the current educational offerings or industry guidance offerings in the market, and so on and so on. So the first research report that we've released, which is over the last fortnight, was really focused on trying to provide a new view of all companies that have to report under the ASRS reporting universe. The last time formal work was released in this domain or any number crunching and analysis, was when Federal Treasury released their policy impact analysis in November 2023. At the time, They produced some high-level numbers on how many companies they had estimated might be in Group 1, 2, and 3. And like most government and desktop public policy analyses, whilst quite rigorous and impressive in terms of a cost base estimates on how it might impact the broader community, it was a top-down analysis. What we've sought to do with this research is do a bottom-up inventory of every business in Australia and profile them according to whether they are in Group 1, 2, and 3. And do so in the context of two things. One is it's a different time. So November 2023 was some time ago, of course, close to 2 years ago. The economy changes, businesses merge, businesses grow, businesses become bankrupt or default, sorry, and these numbers will change. In addition, the second piece is, of course, this was conducted prior to the legislation passing the Senate. So some of the modifications weren't quite in the reporting requirements weren't quite captured in this analysis at the time, which mostly have a bearing on what the likely cost impact would be on corporates reporting against the regime. So using Purpose Bureau's database on every business in Australia and conducting a ground-up view, we've not only been able to come up with a new set of numbers on how many companies are in Group 1, 2, and 3, but also leverage a lot of the cross-sectional insights so we can better understand and interrogate what it is about these businesses that make them that drive their reporting needs or the style and characteristics of their reporting. So the way that we've approached that is build up a ground-up database. We've organized hundreds of variables, and this research provides a vantage point into who those businesses are, and then provides an introduction or a window into how prepared they are. The key insights in this report are across initially have a variation, or we've observed a variation in what Treasury calculated in the number of companies. So in Group 1, we've got 7% more companies in Group 1 reporting in Australia than what was previously estimated. Not a massive number, but certainly another 100 companies or so that weren't captured in the initial inventory by Treasury. Across Group 1, 2, and 3, however, we've got 25% more companies by our estimation that are captured in ASRS reporting requirements. Now, it should be noted that those reporting under Group 3 will be reporting in a couple of years' time. So that number could change even further, as the way that we've approached the analysis today is by counting how many businesses would have to report should these reporting requirements exist today. The second one, I think, is one of the more interesting layers that we've been able to introduce is better understanding the types of businesses these are from an ownership structure standpoint. So, of course, when we look across Group 1 and Group 2, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of focus points around how ASX companies are typically progressing through their reporting requirements and how well prepared they are. There's many good reasons for that. They do have quite a bearing on the total business emissions in Australia, which our second release will dig into deeper. However, when in our analysis, we've been able to observe that about 60%, or the lion's share of businesses under Group 1 and 2, are in fact privately owned. And then of the 40 or so percent that are not privately owned, i.e. listed, more than half of those are foreign listed businesses. So businesses we know, we would know by a common name, of course, like Microsoft, listed over in the United States, Amazon, likewise, and so on and so on. So the domestic listed.
Nick, did you want to share the slides? We can't see them.
Yes. Just confirming you guys can see this slide. Terence, just confirming you can see this slide. Yeah, cool, great. So, sorry, I didn't commit to my promise on removing my face as I started talking numbers. So here's a bit of a prettier picture. What we're looking on the right, of course, as I mentioned, is that about 60 is that of Group 1 companies, the lion's share are unlisted businesses, and of the listed businesses, there's more foreign listed businesses than domestic listed businesses. That's one of the key insights, I think, that sets some really great context for why we're observing different patterns in how prepared companies are, and also some of the structure around why some may have already got existing reporting obligations in other jurisdictions that they will have already complied with, and more. Another big key insight is the industry composition of these. Sorry, I'll just jump down here. The industry composition of the reporting companies. So this is another analysis or vantage point that hasn't been provided before as part of the Treasury reporting and analysis. The key ANZIC division, the kind of high level industry across Australia that captures that has the highest proportion of companies in Group 1, is manufacturing. Now, that is largely, and again, our second release will unpick this more as we uncover the story of NGO companies, but that is largely driven by companies that have to report under the National Greenhouse Emissions Reporting Agency. So under the NGO agency. So when you account for that, the larger industries are in fact professional services and technical services, and financial and insurance services, which is a big insight when we were uncovering the work, in my view, because it told us that there's a lot of businesses proportionally that have a lot of their climate risk sitting in their value chain rather than their direct operations. The last piece I wanted to just touch on was about preparedness. So one thing we've done is we've got a lot of information, of course, on how these businesses have reported to date, what kinds of disclosures they've made. The ASRS reporting requirements are some of the most advanced in the world. So it's not that easy to look at one particular standard and say, if you've met that, you've met ASRS reporting requirements under their current format. What we've conducted for a variety of reasons is a fairly crude measure of preparedness for the purpose of this report. And that is where we're looking at whether businesses have made any disclosures, whether they've made disclosures according to, but not according to a accounting framework. Another one is whether they've made disclosures according to a recognized accounting framework, such as TCFD, and another one is whether businesses have made disclosures according to an accounting framework and had those at least limited assurance audited. And so when we do that across all industry subdivisions across the whole country, what we observe is that businesses in the telco sector, so what's typically called the wired telecommunications operator sector, and the computer and wholesaling and tech sector feature quite highly on those that are quite mature. These are sectors that are also driven, mind you, by a lot of foreign listed businesses. And then looking at businesses that have the least prepared, we do in fact see a lot of heavy industry and emissions exposed industries, such as fossil fuel electricity generation, transport services, electricity distribution, and so on. It should be worth, and perhaps we'll talk about this a bit later on, but whilst we're observing disclosures in these industries, the level of assurance does not meet the level of assurance we observe in these other industries that are performing much better. The last thing that I wanted to note on one of the insights is around preparedness, looking at it from a business structure standpoint. One of the key observations, in my view, that was quite illuminating was how well prepared foreign listed businesses are in Group 1 to meet ASRS reporting requirements versus domestic unlisted businesses. Essentially 3 to 4 times foreign listed businesses are 3 to 4 times more prepared than domestic unlisted, um, which may or may not intuitively be shocking. However, foreign listed businesses are still twice as prepared than domestic listed businesses. And so it's using some of these cross-sectional insights about business structure and ownership types and shape and origin have been quite interesting to better understand what are the drivers of these preparedness as a discussion point. And that's what we're looking to hopefully get more out of today's panel session on as well. So that was the brief overview on the insights of the report. Terence, I might just hand over to you to open up with the panel with some questions on the back of those insights.
Fabulous. Thank you, Nick. And yes, I am working out how to set up my TikTok account. I would also like to acknowledge the lands that we gather and speak from. Melissa and I are in Kulin Nation of the Wurundjeri people and pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. So I might, firstly, Nick and Purpose Bureau, thank you for the opportunity to partner on this work. This has been groundbreaking work, and it's been exciting piece of research to be involved in, and really looking forward to the next reports that are coming out too. And thank you all for taking time to attend the session. Jack, I might start with you in terms of some of the insights. What is the possibility of 7% more Group 1 companies, which is about 80 more, in addition to what Treasury estimated initially, and about 25% more across all groups, mean from the point of view of standard setters such as AASB?
Thank you, Terence. Hi, everybody. Lovely to be here. And yes, thanks, Nick, and to the team for inviting me along from the AASB. As Nick said, I've recently joined as Climate Implementation Lead from the New Zealand context, where New Zealand's been a few years into the similar journey. So doing what I can to bring some of those lessons learned across. But yes, it's a really interesting question. I think that the, as a recently joined member of the Australian Public Service, I guess acknowledge the prior work done by Treasury and ASIC, which, as Nick pointed out, was very much earlier on as part of that sort of policy development side. And, the way it works is that Treasury very much leads on determining the policy and the question on who reports, and the role of the standard setter at the AASB is to determine what the reporting requirements should be. And that was a consultation process that happened over 2023-24 type of time frame, and the feedback was relatively strong back to the AASB to be strongly aligned internationally with the International Sustainability Standards Board, their climate standard S2, which was broadly speaking where the standard landed. I think that I'm definitely a data guy as well, and so I really appreciate when we can slice and dice a data set in different ways to get different perspectives and insights on that. So I certainly think that I've always found it useful to go from talking about, and had a similar experience in New Zealand, talking about that sort of Group 1, 2, 3 level, to then splitting it into particularly industries at a first order level to get basically quite a different picture quite quickly around who makes up the regime. Personally, I'm always looking for opportunities for useful collaboration. So I think for reporting entities to be able to see what industry they're a part of, which they'll know already, but potential collaboration within their sector and across sectors. And it's really interesting given that the climate standard has that value chain concept as well, what the opportunities are going forward to take more of that value chain lens as well. So I think it's really moving things along to have a report like this out in the market, which breaks things down as it's done, and sets up for an interesting discussion today.
Great. Thanks, Jack. Melissa, I want to chat about, I guess, your view and the general view around preparedness. There's different sort of expectations around when companies say preparedness or auditors say preparedness. The analysis assesses preparedness through the lens of tangible fields such as disclosures, audits, and the like. And as we know, ASRS has one of the most comprehensive requirements globally for climate risk. And there can be different views on preparedness. What's your experience on the different expectations regarding preparedness for ASRS inside a corporate when it comes to different stakeholders, such as executive, which is one of your key stakeholders, audit committees, which is the other one, and then the financial auditors, as you'd experience on this topic?
Thanks, Terence. And yeah, thank you for inviting me to be a part of the panel. And thanks to Purpose Bureau and Monash for this report and the insights in it. So I think, Terence, in response to your question, preparedness it's a topic that we've been discussing a lot internally in our business, certainly, and I think in many others that are Group 1 reporters. So one of the things I would say is just because if you look at the public disclosures that are currently out there, I don't think it necessarily is an indication of what's going to be coming in the first year of reporting. Many organisations, including Vicinity, have reported against the TCFD in the past to varying degrees of detail because the TCFD is rather broad in its guidance. As you quite rightly say, Terence, ASRS is very specific and granular in terms of the disclosure requirements and the assurance requirements. So I think that there are probably many organisations that are working toward meeting all of those requirements for Group 1, and will be maybe putting that information out into the public domain for the first time for the next reporting period. So for many organisations, that will be at the end of the 2026 financial year. So one of I think the reasons maybe for some of the reticence to put too much out in the public domain until all of it's been worked through is I think it's important to be aware that while there is sort of a phasing in period, board directors have directors' liabilities under the Corporations Act for these disclosures, and it's really important, I think, for board and audit committees and therefore for the executive team to make sure that, as well as meeting all of the detailed requirements of ASRS, we actually have appropriate controls, systems, practices in place to really ensure that the information is fulsome and accurate and correct. And that we have had that tested by our auditor, and that we can demonstrate that level of process and control to the executive and to our board so that they can feel comfortable with the disclosures. I think that, in the first companies, or certainly many of the ones I speak to, we're really focused on making sure that we meet the regulatory requirements and that we have an unqualified audit report. That may sound like a low bar, but it's actually, there's a lot of work involved in ASRS relative to TCFD. So, dotting all those I's and crossing all of those T's is really important. That said, I think everyone is very conscious of the fact that the information that's being gathered and the analysis that's been done as part of these requirements is really going to be very insightful and useful to businesses in terms of thinking about strategy, thinking about future prospects, and how it is that businesses can better manage any climate-related risks they've identified, both in their own business and their value chain, and leverage any opportunities. So I think that value is absolutely there. I think in the short term, though, there's probably a bit more of a focus on making sure that all of the granular details are in place. With regard to our auditors, I think that, again, we have a very close partnership with our auditors, and we've been working with them very closely to work through how we move from what was voluntary sustainability assurance over climate-related metrics to meeting the requirements of ASRS. And for things that have not previously been assured, so some of the information around climate-related risks and opportunities and governance procedures to make sure that we really fully understand what will be required under the assurance standards, so that we have the appropriate documentation to be able to get an unqualified audit statement for year one. And I think I just also wanted to call out another key stakeholder group, and that is shareholders, investors, and other key stakeholders who I think are really interested probably in seeing the additional level of detail and the more granular detail that will come through ASRS reports as opposed to TCFD reports. And I have no doubt that there'll be a lot of unofficial benchmarking across sectors and within sectors, as not only shareholders, investors, but I think, all participants in the sector are looking to see what our peers are doing and what risks and opportunities they've identified and how that compares to our own. Just so that it's interesting to see what alignment there will be, or not, within a sector, and then again across sectors as well. So I imagine that when these reports come out, that will also provide a lot of additional information into every company's climate risk assessment, because we'll have additional insight into how it is that organisations in our value chain are managing climate-related risks and opportunities.
Thank you, Melissa. You mentioned TCFD. There was a data point around TCFD. I think 80% of the ASX 100 were reporting at some degree to TCFD, but this report shows that Group 1 is 58% private companies domiciled in Australia, and there's very few examples of TCFD reporting in that cohort going back in the past decade. So preparedness, I know there's a question around there's a high bar for preparedness, but ASRS is it's a lot bigger set of onerous requirements than TCFD, and then we've got a large majority of the companies not having looked at TCFD. The other thing I was going to mention, we had the Auditing and Insurance Standards Board meeting yesterday, and it's a public meeting, so I can talk about it. But one of the consultation papers that's going to come out is around whether the director's statement is going to be subject to assurance. And of course, directors have to comment on whether they've taken reasonable steps in the disclosures made. So when we talk about preparedness, directors are going to be very focused around that comment about reasonable steps and what reasonable steps mean. And for most directors in large listed companies, it's a lot more work than less, in my view. So yeah, there's going to be more, I think, more chatter about preparedness and that comment about reasonable steps in their statements. Nick, when you talked about the findings here, I mean, one of the things that you mentioned about the data that you hold, you've got company data on ABN, so that's company data, and then ESG data on all ABNs, and that's just in Australia, but beyond Australia. So it's a ground up analysis, because I think most people listening might be thinking, well, how does this compare with Treasury's analysis? But this is almost factual because you've got actual information that you've assessed it from. One of the mysterious findings for me in the report was that heavily exposed emissions, including energy generation and transport services industry, so these are the heavily exposed emitting industries, were least prepared, in the preparedness analysis. Can you comment on the peculiarities surrounding that? Because obviously those industries in the large cohort have had to report for corporate social responsibility and then NGERS and other purposes. But what was the background to that finding?
Yeah, I think this is to Melissa's point around what using the ASRS results as a kind of proliferation of benchmarking. I think connected with the question you've raised, Terence, I think there's an interesting conversation to be had, which is what type of business is a similar business to ours? When you're talking about large businesses, they tend to be quite diversified operations. Is AGL the same as BP? Well, no, of course not. But they do have some business operations that will be actually similar. Is Vicinity centers the same as Dexus? Absolutely not. They're different vantage points of property, but they do have similar operational similarities. That's what I think we observed in some of the preparedness findings. So when you look at businesses that are purely electricity generation businesses, they will be classified as purely an electricity generation businesses. That is not an AGL. AGL are diversified businesses, as an example. Purely electricity generation businesses tend to be privately owned businesses. So you see more of those, and same with other transport services businesses, tend to be those privately owned businesses where they're more smaller exclusive operations, not those larger diversified businesses. So when going a bit deeper into that, it made some sense where you would intuitively say, look, your AGLs of the world would have quite substantive programs. We wouldn't have expected them to be there. Well, they're not. They're actually not purely other electricity generation businesses.
Now that makes a lot of sense. And going back to that point, Nick, about 58% of the Group 1 being privately held, and that includes private equity. And then you've got 23% foreign owned, like Engie, for example, that has operations here. So that makes a lot of sense. Jack, as businesses are preparing for ASRS, there are aspects of reporting that we learn will form part of the ongoing evaluation of guidance in coming years. So what have you got, in the works as AASB in terms of guidance that might be coming out in the next 3 to 4 months that we could expect to utilize in this reporting?
Thanks, Terence. Yeah, this year we developed a new AASB S2 specific knowledge hub. So on there we've uploaded 4 guidance documents already, covering things like greenhouse gas emissions, which itself has a strong value chain dimension. We've got an overview of the sustainability reporting standards, a comparison to the TCFD, and proportionality. On the horizon, on a forward-looking basis, we're currently working on materiality and anticipated financial effects. Those documents are largely adaptations of documents that the IFRS Foundation has put together at an international level. So we're adapting to suit the Australian market. We're also in discussion with Treasury and ASIC at the moment on the back of the Treasury's recent consultation on transition planning. And then we're also working with ASIC on educational materials, which covers some of the more foundational concepts that underpin the standard. Also aware that the IASB has other things in their pipeline that we'll likely pick up as those start to come through. So yeah, I mean, we've got lots in the pipeline, and we're also all ears from the market if there are areas that people want the AASB to tackle that's perceived to be a gap. We're very much keen to hear where that might be, and I think potentially some reports like this can help to spur that sort of discussion.
Amazing. Thanks, Jack. I also heard that IAASB is putting out some videos which are a little bit easier to consume. So do look up the IAASB site for certain guidance. Melissa, if I can come back to you, one of the findings in the report was that the top 6 industry classes in Group 1 exposed to ASRS are in the value chains of mining and finance, not mining and finance per se. And that's partly because we looked at the number of companies exposed, and we've got a limited number of mining and finance large companies in the Group 1. But as we started this journey, I remember having lots of conversations about how important Scope 3 was going to be to look at climate risk in Australia. And I think this finding does attest to Scope 3 being quite important. And I know you've done lots of work on Scope 3. A lot of climate risk, basically what this finding says is that a lot of the climate risk in Australian corporates is outside their boundary, right? So what, I guess, how important is the work on value chain impacts, both upstream and downstream, given this finding, and what have you learned from your work at Vicinity?
I think that's a good question, Terence, and I think that it really does highlight the value of Scope 3, which we all know is really tricky to work through. But I think really important, because I think when you have a handle on your Scope 3 exposure, it really does give that additional insight into potential risks and opportunities in the value chain. I feel like, the value chain work is something that needs to be a really important consideration in your broader climate risk and opportunity assessment, and really thinking comprehensively around the different aspects of your value chain and how that may impact on your business, and thinking, sometimes a couple of steps away from your direct operations as well, to think about how other things happening in the economy or in other sectors may influence or impact your business. I think that COVID taught us all that lesson very well. So I think that that's a key part of it. And I also think that what that does is both the Scope 3 and understanding what that actually means, because you may have certain exposures to Scope 3 or to certain value chain sectors, but you've got a plan in place to mitigate that, or you have an ability to do that. And that's great. I think that where it starts getting much more complicated is where it's not always obvious about how you can actually have any influence over that. And I think that that's what some businesses are grappling with, particularly, and I'm thinking more not about the sector the Vicinity's in, but in other sectors. Things like long haul transport and other sectors where there's not necessarily commercially available technology to solve some of these challenges. And I think that what I feel will happen more and more, and we're already seeing it in some sectors, is some of this collaboration, be that within a sector or through a third party, such as financiers or governments in some cases, to look to how we could address some of these impacts, because they can have a really significant knock-on impact to many different companies and even a number of different sectors as well. So I guess, my view is do the work to understand where those impacts are, and even if you don't feel you have any ability to influence, work out at least what the problem is, and then start thinking creatively about how you can influence it. I think one of the things that I find helpful is we're all in this together. When I think about some of our business partners, such as our joint venture partners and others, some of whom, are private companies, we're all in the same situation. We're wanting to achieve the same thing in terms of understanding our impacts and working together to see what we can do to reduce risk. And that's where I think some of those conversations can be really helpful. And the fact that companies that maybe previously were not caught up in some of these reporting requirements are now caught up. It's sort of, I guess, sharpened their focus on gathering data, sharing relevant data, and thinking about how we address some of these challenges.
Thanks, Melissa. I do think for a large part of the TCFD reporting and so on, we had spend-based analysis using input-output modeling for Scope 3 and value chain work, particularly for the emissions. Not a lot of work done at all on the physical risk side, and that definitely needs to be strengthened going forward, given this finding that a lot of the risks are in the value chain. So very helpful. Thank you. I was going to also just make a note. I mean, one of the things that Nick didn't cover in the highlights, but it did stand out for me, is that Group 2, if you go to the report, is a much smaller cohort than most people believe. So Group 2 is about 650 companies, whereas Group 1 is 1,169 companies. Group 3 is obviously huge. But just that just stood out for me, and I just thought that's worth commenting on, because I think people just sort of think of this as a expanding set of groups, but Group 2 is actually smaller than Group 1, which sort of defies business growth logic. But anyway, that's what it is. There's a question around director's declaration, and the question is, does it involve more than what's covered under the Corps Act? The answer, I can take this one. It is a different set of words around the disclosures, and it's around directors having taken reasonable steps to prepare and sign off these declarations, so disclosures. So it is more than what's in the Corps Act. There's a question around a lot of noise about Scope 3 emission factors. Will they be declared as an official reference from AASB or a specific guidance released in the near future? Jack, did you want to take that? And this sort of probably goes back to, I guess, the work that was done by AASB. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Terence. Yep.
Yep, go for it.
Yeah, thanks, Terence. Yes, so we just recently had a submission through on emissions factors to our implementation advisory panel. So that's a panel that we've set up at the AASB to support implementation and to, so we were grateful to receive a question around this. We've, we have responded to that by putting a link to the DQ emissions factors on our website. We are also, aware that there is this much more kind of global picture around the use of emissions factors for different organisations who might have, a need to look beyond just purely domestic. So look, it's an area that we are, interested to hear feedback around. If people are, finding that difficult, or whether or not, they're managing to access the emissions factors that they consider they need to, prepare their Scope 3 disclosures in particular. So, if there's more feedback for us on that, we're keen to hear it. But we've pointed to the DQ ones which are publicly available, yes.
Jack, can you hear me now? I think
Yep.
I dropped out, but I might throw back to Nick to wrap up the session.
Joe, no problem. Thanks very much, Terence, and thanks, Jack and Melissa, for some of that insight. What we're trying to do with this climate risk series is not just put out a report with some numbers that can kind of contribute to the debate, and then we all move on to the next big questions. What we're trying to do is build a building block that we can continue to extract practical insights for industry from. So what that requires or required is building a really intelligent, cross-sectional, deep assessment of every business, and then using that as the basis of monitoring them going forward. So what this first report has done is provide what, whilst the findings are quite, in my view, transformative and revealing, very much a first step of interrogation. Going forward, what we'll be looking to do is a variety of things to make the insights we can access from this database that we're monitoring more widely available, but also more specifically practicable for businesses. And the ways in which we're doing that is we firstly are using the insights from the database to create industry-specific benchmarking insights. So not dissimilar to what, again, Melissa referred to about this kind of need to understand how are you compared to your peers as a sustainability, as a community of practice, what are your peers observing that you aren't, or what have you observed that your peers haven't, and so on. What we're going to be doing is hosting industry roundtable webinars where we'll go deeper into a particular sector. We've got our first one with the Infrastructure Sustainability Council in 2 weeks' time on the 28th of October, where we'll be looking at all the industries within the infrastructure sector, including but not limited to the engineering consulting industry, the building materials industry, construction services, and utility sectors, and looking at not just as a whole macro, but within those industries, what does preparedness look like? What's the composition of businesses? And a whole bunch more insights as well. Equally, we'll also be releasing, and we'll be continuing those industry roundtables over the coming months. We'll be reaching out to all organisations, certainly that registered to this webinar, but on broader lists and correspondence as well, to ensure that we get as many industry participants at each roundtable as possible. The second report that we're releasing is also in early November, so in about 3 weeks. This is where we, in my view, start to get to some of the nerdier, cooler insights and applications of some of these of the IP that we've built essentially. What we really want to explore is understanding, okay, we now understand the reporting universe. How do we better understand climate risk? From a concentration standpoint, how do we understand whether businesses have climate risk sitting within their operations versus their value chain, and how do we proportionally distribute that across ASRS? And I think what you'll see once we start releasing those insights is some of the similar patterns we're seeing from report 1, which is a lot of sectors where there might be value chain emissions exposure, etc. Also emerging in report 2 when we start to unpick where or what the most common type of climate risk is for organizations across the economy. We'll also be digging in deeper across NGER, those businesses that have direct emissions versus value chain emissions as well, and answering kind of what I think are some pretty again transformative, revealing insights, such as how many companies in the country are responsible for how much of the country's emissions, who are those companies, and so on. The last bit that I wanted to add on where this research series will continue to evolve is being able to do some really cool stuff in looking at how businesses understand, how we can use it to better understand transition risk across the value chain. So by function of us working a lot with industry, Purpose Bureau in helping them with their costs, understanding their value chain risk and understanding who trade partners are, we've been able to develop a really, really good sense of what the average cost composition is of a particular industry. So if you're in the telco sector, how much do you usually spend on electrical goods versus your auditors versus your legal services? And digging in even deeper to that and saying, okay, within these kind of areas that you spend money in, that you may or may not be exposed to climate risk, how concentrated are those markets? How much buying choice do you have as a business to be able to swap who you trade with or who you partner with if you are trying to manage climate risk? And that provides, on a macro level, some really, really fascinating insights into, are there certain businesses across the economy that matter most from an economic standpoint to ensure that they're managing transition risk than others? And so there's a lot of different avenues that this research will be evolving through over the coming months, both at industry level and then going deeper on climate risk. And we'll keep everyone in the loop on when those research outputs come out and what opportunities we'll have to digest it. Once again, today's recording will be distributed on the Purpose Bureau YouTube channel. I didn't know we had one, Naomi. But we'll have it on the Purpose Bureau YouTube channel. If Terence finally gets his TikTok channel up, we'll put it there as well. And we'll also be emailing out direct links to the report. I'll also say that Jack at AASB is very, very interested in making sure that they get the right industry feedback. We'll be also distributing an email link you can use to go directly to AASB and canvass any queries or questions you have with any outstanding guidance they've released or upcoming expected guidance regarding ASRS reporting requirements. We've managed to land exactly on time and finish up at 11:55. And so that'll conclude today's session. Thank you everyone for joining again. And like I said, we'll send out some communications to wrap up, and you can access materials offline. Thanks, Terence, Jack, and Melissa. I really appreciate your participation today.